This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
Hello.
Happy Friday.
It is. This whole week has felt like Friday of next week. It's been so long.
Yeah, you have been saying, oh, don't forget tomorrow, like all week.
Yeah.
In reference to today.
On Monday. Yep, it's great. Oh, Chris, you were on Rubber Duck Dev Show Wednesday night, and I got to watch like the first 4 minutes of it. Like Beckett was watching it with me.
Nice.
And then Spencer texted me, and I immediately went to a work thing, and then my power went out. So I hope you had a great time, but I didn't get to see any of it. So
yeah, it was fun. It was fun. Andrew was trolling as usual. So
per usual.
Yep, not much has changed.
Somebody at work today said they were impressed because Andrew made a statement, and it was either like really offensive or like a really nice compliment. And I was like, that's pretty much just like Andrew's MO.
Yeah, but I always mean it as a compliment.
Well, I don't know how to respond to that.
I have brutally insulted Jason on multiple occasions trying to give him a compliment. It's basically my MO.
All right. So 2 weeks ago, I was working with Tailwind UI, and as a Rails developer who wants to try and stick within like the Hotwire world, the HTML world, I don't use the React or Vue Tailwind UI components, right? But that also brings me a great deal of sadness and pain as soon as I get to like a modal, specifically modals right into. But anytime I see requires.js on a Tailwind UI snippet, I just die a little bit inside. And so I thought, I will reevaluate Alpine.js. And around this time, I get an email from Alpine because I bought their components. I got an email saying that, hey, we are going to build an Alpine version of Headless UI. And Headless UI, if you're unaware, is the underlying library in Tailwind UI for the React and Vue components. This was thrilling, and I thought, I'll give this a whirl. So I got a modal working in my little vanilla Rails stack with Alpine and HTML and all the things in literally like minutes. And so I emailed their support, which goes directly to the creator of Alpine. I said, hey, this is wonderful. Also, we should talk about this on Remote Ruby. And so today we have Caleb Porzio with us, the creator of Alpine.js, and also creator of another library we've talked about a little bit on the show, Laravel Livewire, which is similar to Phoenix Live View and Stimulus Reflex Hotwire. So Caleb, a lot to dig into, but thanks for joining us.
yeah, thanks for having me. Super excited to dig in to it all and talk to some Ruby people. I was telling you I'd never talked to Rails people really. I don't know many. I know like one or two Rails devs, and I don't know, but I like lurk on the community hard forever. So it's just excited to talk about stuff.
I'm thrilled. We tell people often that like we're a Laravel podcast because we actually, well, I can't say we, but I lurk on Laravel a lot. And
Nice.
So I always love the intermingling of our two communities.
Yeah. Yep. I love it. There should be more and more of it. I dig it.
It's cool. It's cool. So we'll start with Alpine. Before we dig into that, do you mind maybe just giving kind of a brief introduction, how long you've been programming, what your day job is, things like that?
Like a lot of people been programming forever, it seems to me, like TI-83 TI basic, anybody like from high school or whatever?
Yeah.
That's what got me started.
Same thing. Like I was programming a little bit before that, but then when you have that, you can actually do something that you can use in class or whatever. That like gives you a purpose to programming at that point.
Yep, totally. And I'm just going to drop one more deep cut just in case anybody listening, the same thing happened to them. I used to play RuneScape a lot. This game that whatever was popular. And there was this program Scar shit compared to AutoRune. And it was like you programmed in Pascal to basically hack RuneScape and make like auto clickers and stuff like that. And that was my real like first coding experience. And I'm dropping that in case somebody listening came up that same way.
I am a RuneScape, OG RuneScape player, but I was like all in Cheat Engine and stuff like that. I was too young at that point to really be able to code anything.
Okay.
So I hadn't graduated at that point, but yeah, I was deep in RuneScape.
Yeah. I found out my co-host of our podcast, No Plans to Merge, exact same thing with him. Shit compared to AutoRune. Pascal, that was his exact first. And we're like the exact same age. It's just hilarious. So yeah, whatever. Been programming a while. And yeah, I've been in PHP most of my career. And a little before then, that's kind of where I started, and CodeIgniter, and then Laravel. And once I found Laravel, I was just hook, line, and sinker into Laravel. But I've basically been there ever since. I've worked at product companies and agencies, and then I went out on my own after I started. I just wanted to try open source on my own. So I just quit my job with no plan and started hacking and built Livewire. It was like supposed to be like a port of Phoenix LiveView, but it turned into its own thing. But yeah, so I started working on Livewire and basically never got another job and found a way to make money on it, enough to live off of. And then along the way, I built Alpine. And so that's been my life. That is my life. I'm just an open source developer who occasionally makes educational materials to sell and keep doing open source.
That sounds a lot like Chris. Someone who does a massive amount of open source and runs Go Rails and things like that. So
nice.
Yeah. Our equivalent of Laracast, kind of. So
whoa. What? Laracast?
Oh yeah, that's funny. Yeah, get on that. Get on. It is Laracasts.
Yeah.
I used to call it Laravel and Adam Wathen. I remember I used to call him Adam Wathen and use Laravel and everything. But then you watch one conference talk and are shamed out of that.
It's cool that you do open source. I remember, and correct me if this isn't you, but I remember, I think a blog post you wrote maybe a couple of years back. It went really big on Hacker News too. It was, I quit my day job or I make X amount of money doing open source a year. That was you, right?
Yeah,
right.
I cracked 100K.
That's what it was. Yep.
Yeah. And the whole post is like, I open with, I posted and blurred out like the sensitive information on my tax return for the year before. And it was like $30,000 for the entire year. And then, and so I cracked 100K with open source and wrote a post. Yeah. It is the most visited post on my site. And I still get a lot of, it actually made another round on Hacker News like a couple months ago.
Okay.
For some reason. I don't know why, but somebody was like, hey, you're on Hacker News again.
Yeah. That's a post I regularly share with people who are looking for an idea of how do I fund open source work or whatever. And there was something about it that the way you have it positioned to me, it feels like you are sponsoring it. So you get something in return and kind of are purchasing something rather than it feeling like a donation, which I think a lot of people are much more willing to give money when they're like, oh, I get these videos in return and get something out of it, as opposed to a thank you or something simple or whatever. It just feels like a giving money away as opposed to sort of buying something or whatever. So yeah, it just seems like something really rang very true with a lot of the people who support you and everything, which I thought was awesome.
Yeah. Still, I've tried so many other monetization strategies. I'm currently trying premium support for companies and everything, but people don't donate money. Some people do, but to make a living off of that is just, I don't know. My advice to anybody who would want to get into this or do make any money in open source, don't even really mess around with the $5 coffee bit. Just skip that part. You're not going to make any meaningful amount of money. Just go right to building something or just offering something of value and charging for it. And then you can kind of do this half, I'm charging for the thing, but you're also supporting my thing. And people like that. And it's nice as a creator to also feel like there's a lot more goodwill wrapped up in the things you're selling. And so make a video, make something and sell it. Don't just ask for donations because I've tried it and I've seen everybody. I'm sure you've seen, maybe you guys have done it yourself. That doesn't really work for anybody.
And often too, we'll start sponsoring someone and then 6 months later, I'll get my GitHub bill and it's 10 sponsorships. I'm like, whoa, I need to trim that down. And so it's not consistent as someone who contributes. I change who I contribute to. So yeah, it's not.
Yeah, that's a whole other, I actually just switched my strategy to one-off sponsorships. And so it's $99 once for access to all the screencasts instead of $14 a month. Because the churn is just huge. So many people drop off after the first month or two. And as a sponsor myself, I get that when you sponsor somebody, there's now this whole awkward thing where at some point you're going to want to unsponsor them and you're going to know that they're going to see it. And then it feels like the only reason I'm retaining people is for non-cancel shaming. So right. I don't know. I was just capture a reasonable amount of lifetime value upfront and just stick with that. And so far it's worked.
Chris, your point too, you said value. And I was thinking it is funny, I guess I would see having access to educational materials and screencasts as value, but really I feel like having open source also adds value, but I view it differently sometimes. I don't mean to, but I do.
No, I mean, right. I mean, because that's the way it is with everything else. So it's kind of like how if you go to sell an ebook and you call it an ebook, people think, oh, this should cost what other ebooks cost. With the Make VS Code Awesome thing, I made it a course, and recorded screencasts and whatever, so that you can sell it as a course. And people are like, oh yeah, courses, those cost a couple $100. But ebooks, those are $20. So it's sort of the same thing where like open source, oh, that's free. That's free code. Who's going to be like, this one package in my huge stack of 1 million packages, I'm going to really contribute to this guy and his thing.
We could have avoided LeftPad. We would just sponsor.
I know what to say. Yeah, right.
So speaking of open source, and I led into the conversation with this, Alpine.js, I have a lot of questions, a lot of things I want to chat about. But before we do that, do you mind giving an overview of what Alpine is, just for those listening who've not heard of it before?
Yeah. So I would say the promise is, I'm guessing your listeners are familiar with Stimulus. That would be something most
It's a safe assumption, yeah.
Yeah. So I would say the pitch is almost the exact same as Stimulus, the reason for building Alpine. So for me, I wanted to build a modern jQuery. jQuery to me was really, it was great when I first started, and I think the whole web community underwent this journey. It was really great, but it's super imperative. Like everything, all of the interaction you want in your app, you have to program like, okay, I'm going to listen for a click on this button, and then when this happens, I'm going to change this part of the HTML. So whatever, I think it was great at the time, but obviously like with new frameworks, like Vue is what I got really into, but Angular was the first thing that I really encountered. And I just saw ng model, I think was the directive in Angular, that you could like bind data to your HTML and it just was all taken care of. And I saw that, and that was like a real like game changer for me. So anyway, so then kind of coming off of the SPA mountaintop, where I wasn't building as many full JavaScript apps for all the majestic monolith reasons, like long live the monolith. I'm into that. I wanted to get back to, I can like drop all these Rails things and you guys like know it all better than I do. But like DHH, one of his quotes is like, party with productivity like the days of yore. So I was leaning really heavily into all that stuff and doing a lot of just HTML over the wire. What did he call it? It was like server rendered. You guys had server rendered JavaScript?
Yeah. It was basically Rails.js, unintrusive JavaScript. We would render like these templates, these like partials that were JS partials. So they would just execute JavaScript.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So anyway, I started getting into that whole world of simplicity, but I really missed some of the reactivity of those front-end frameworks like Vue. There was this, you just deal with your data and you sort of link your HTML to your data in a few places, and then everything is just declarative instead of imperative. You don't have to say, listen for a click on this button, then change this bit of HTML. You just say, hey, button, when you're clicked, change this piece of data. And then in the other part of your HTML, you say, hey, you just mirror this data. So I wanted to basically find the simplicity of jQuery, just drop in a CDN, no build. I was like, this was a real reaction against the whole modern JavaScript movement. So I didn't want any build step in my workflow. I didn't want any dependency tree and any of this stuff. I just wanted jQuery, drop in a CDN and have a thing that's really simple and easy to use. And then, yeah, whatever. And so that's kind of the why, or the birth of Alpine. Was I literally just sat down and started brainstorming like, okay, Stimulus is what I want in theory, but for my tastes and whatever, and my history with Vue, it felt really imperative to me. Like I still had to write a bunch of manual DOM manipulation stuff and event listening. So I just kind of sat down and was like, well, I really want Vue.js, but simpler in XYZ way. And,
Around when did you start Alpine? Because Stimulus was out then, I guess?
Yeah.
Before you started?
Yep. I started Alpine the year or two before COVID. I don't know. That's, I think in like COVID years, like AD and BC, but like COVID.
Yeah.
1B COVID.
Yeah, that's interesting, which is really cool too, to see that influenced it as well and gave you an idea of like, okay, this is in the right direction, but it's still a little bit different than what I want. And I think what's really cool is sort of controller being separate in your Stimulus code from the HTML. Like everything's nicely integrated together with Alpine. You can put stuff right together like you would
so
do.
You
with,
use Stimulus with Alpine?
I've used both actually. So I redesigned the Go Rails website a while back and used Tailwind. And then I had some Stimulus stuff in there for my features. But then I was using Tailwind UI and copying the Alpine stuff and using a combination of both. So I'm sure we've maybe been close to interacting because there's been a few times where I was like working with Turbo and making sure that Alpine worked correctly with, that when the page changes or whatever. And so that was definitely great. It is really nice to be in one mindset when you're working with the HTML and you can do everything right there. Because there is that jump between things where you write your HTML, then you got to jump to the JavaScript and like context switch a lot more, I feel like. And it feels more intuitive to be all there together.
Yes, Tailwind was a big influence for me as well, because it was like the magic of co-location. This file now, the behavior and the styling and everything is co-located. I mean, it's like a reaction on a reaction. It's like we used to have everything all piled in. You got like one PHP file with all your HTML and your inline styles and your on-click JavaScripts. And then it's like, no, let's separate it all out. We have like object-oriented CSS and BEM and all this stuff. And then it's like, we're going back to that place in a better way, like any sort of antithesis synthesis kind of thing. And so that's Alpine. Is if we keep it all in this, like next to the HTML, it's actually easier to maintain. It's easier to build. It's less context switching, less files to manage for one little feature.
Aside from having all the concerns kind of in one place now, what are maybe some of the other things that Alpine does, maybe directly correlated to like Stimulus?
I guess the reason I built it was there needs to be a super easy way to make a drop down to like toggle stuff. That has to be first goal. That's what it was with Alpine, was modal drop down in tabs. It's like the README originally was just 3 code examples of here's a tool whose basically its main purpose is for you to be able to make modals, drop downs, and tabs, this little interactivity stuff, but not have to manually hide an element or transition an element or do any of that stuff. It's like in Vue, it's just VIF or VShow or whatever. And so in Alpine, it's just X show, and you can have some Boolean, any just Boolean, and it'll just react. It's like you have a little div, X show is open or whatever, and then is open can be changed anywhere else. But that's what its goal. And so to this day, that's sort of its main use case for me, is like all those little interactive bits that don't require server interaction at all. They're just little ephemeral toggling stuff on the front end with some transitions and whatever. And I guess what started out as, I'll just create this small little tool for the simple little use case, of course, like years later and rewrites later and zillions of PRs and issues and whatever later. Hopefully it still feels like that's what it's all about, even though there's lots more it can do now. And I've really internalized how complex all these things really are.
I think that's where it really shines, though, as in being like a really small library. Like I have only used Alpine on my static sites recently.
Nice.
Because I'm like, I just want to plop it in and toggle this damn nav bar. You know, I don't want to get complex with it. And Alpine allows you to do that really easily, to the point where the first time I ever saw it was when it was in the Tailwind UI examples.
Nice.
And when I first saw it, I was like, this just makes sense. And I liked it better than Stimulus. And I remember getting crap for that from people who were bullish on Stimulus. But I was like, no, this just makes sense, especially with when you start getting into the X4, doing for loops and templating and all this other stuff that like was a lot harder to do with Stimulus, or even I didn't know how to do it with Stimulus because I'm not a JavaScript developer. So I was like, this just makes so much more sense.
Yeah. Especially after like building the thing and realizing like X4 is a great example of something that, I guess for the listener, X4 is just a way to, I guess, loop data into a template. So if you have, I don't know, a list of posts and the posts are in JSON, you can pretty easily make a table of posts. But like just building that and the complexity and like really nailing that kind of thing is really bizarre, like more than you'd think, more than I'd think. And so, it just makes all those things really easy where, it's like, I don't want to dump on another tool, but Stimulus for me was, I guess, I don't know, you got to sell your thing hard and I'll just sell it hard. To me, I don't see why I would ever use Stimulus. Rails is fantastic. Hotwire, I dig. obviously immeasurable contributions from DHH and the Rails community and everything and whatever. But for some reason, Stimulus just doesn't click with me. I'm always like, isn't this just basically vanilla JavaScript with like a few little helpers? I don't know.
Do you ever have a situation where like, so good example might be Stripe checkout or something where you have to do JavaScript events with some third-party JavaScript.
Yeah.
Is that one that you could have a good solution for in Alpine? Because I see sort of the obvious ones are really simple, like toggling the navbar, and those are great, good examples. But then what happens when you have to listen to a callback from the Stripe JavaScript and yada, yada? That one, I would love to hear your take on, like, how would you implement that?
I mean, as far as like listening for events from third-party JavaScript libraries. So let's say that you initialize Stripe checkout on some input or something, and it's inside of an Alpine component. That's all well and good. If you need to listen for some event from Stripe checkout in your HTML, you would have X on any element, and it'll listen just like as if you are directly attaching an event listener. So it'll listen to something bubbling up from underneath. So if it's wrapping the Stripe checkout, you could say X on : and then just the name of any custom event. So if Stripe emits like 5 different events, you'd have 5 different X on : and then the name of that event, and then just an expression of JavaScript. So you can do something simple, or if you need to break out into more JavaScript, you can call a method, an Alpine method, so I'll try to keep this really brief rather than speaking out all of Alpine syntax to the entire listener base. But everything in Alpine starts with X data. So anywhere in your DOM, you write X data. It's a HTML attribute. And inside of there, you literally write JSON literal. It's not even JSON, not JSON, a JavaScript object. So like curly braces and keys and values. And then that data, so maybe that's open : false. And then that data is now made available to everywhere inside of that element. So you can, in Alpine, you could say X show open and just reference it. Okay, so back to Stripe, that X data is just a plain JavaScript object. So you can have state and methods. So you could have a method called handle Stripe whatever and call it from an event listener. And then inside that method, you're just in plain JavaScript. And there's lifecycle hooks. You could just have an init method, and that'll run when it all boots up. So usually if I'm dealing with a third-party package, I'll boot it up inside init. So inside that little init, or xinit is a directive. You could literally put xinit anywhere in the HTML and be like new Stripe checkout and pass in a ref to the element. You don't even have to do query selector. You could just have like xref on any element and then reference it like $refs dot whatever. For people who don't know Alpine, I'm speaking gibberish. So I guess like those are some of the things I think it's best at, is integrating with third-party libraries, date pickers, tricks. Like I have a whole tricks integration with Alpine, and it's sort of the same deal. It's put the tricks editor right in there and then listen to all the events in Alpine. I don't know. I think it's a lot of fun to work with stuff like that.
One thing I like Chris, in a project we're working on right now, because I adopted Alpine kind of late in the game, I am actually running both Stimulus and Alpine.
Okay.
And something I just learned about is talking about X data is I'm actually defining it by importing Alpine like in a JavaScript file, like importing the module and declaring data.
Yeah.
And it's nice because then like for this drop down functionality, I can reuse it multiple times, like for different styles of drop downs, and all the functions are declared in JavaScript. So I thought that was a really nice touch as well.
Yeah. I think that's the other kind of good point to make, is that you can use it in a very Tailwindy way where everything's just literally in your markup, and you can do that all day. I do crazy things like have a huge JavaScript object like right in the markup and no syntax highlighting, like a lunatic, but I like that. But there's like first party, Alpine.data. That's very Stimulus feeling, where you have a separate JavaScript file that has your state and your behavior, and then you can just call those things. Honestly, that's kind of Stimulus mode. I was after Stimulus's. One thing I really loved about Stimulus is the composing of different controllers, like directly in your markup, how you can just, I forget the exact syntax, maybe just comma separated list of controllers. Is that how Stimulus does it?
Just with a space. So like data controller,
okay.
Yeah, namespace.
Yep. So I really dug that. And with data, you can do that because they're plain objects. You can literally object destructure, like right in your HTML. It could be like ... drop down, comma, ... modal, all in one curly brace and have and compose all those. Basically, they're the equivalent to controllers.
Yeah, I was going to say that's like really awesome because you have the flexibility of both. So you have the simplicity of like, yeah, we'll just do it all in line and we don't even have to define any controller. But if we really did need more complicated stuff, like making a fetch request or whatever, and needed to do something fancy that's quite a few lines, you can pull it out and organize it, but you don't have to, which you do have to with Stimulus. So that's like really cool to have the balance of both wherever you need it.
Right. Yep. Totally. Balance of both. And then there's things that I think like with something like Stimulus, how would you make a transition on a modal? Like how would you fade something in?
I just want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Honeybadger. They are not only my favorite error and uptime monitoring service, but they've also added several awesome new features. One of those being the public status pages. So it makes perfect sense that your error and uptime monitoring tool can have a public status page for you to communicate any downtime outages with your customers. So whether US East 1 is down or you forgot to add a configuration file, Honeybadger is there for you to help communicate any downtime or outages with your customers. Plus, they've also added SSL certificate monitoring. So like many of us use these days, Let's Encrypt certificates expire every 90 days. And if for some reason you're a week away from expiring an SSL certificate, they can let you know ahead of time so that you can take care of it without any outages for your customers. Plus, managing the errors and things inside of Honeybadger has gotten even easier with Honeybadger Actions, which you can use to automatically assign errors to yourself or another team member, add tags to different error classes, and more. And they also have batch actions, which you can use on the search results to help manage your backlog of work to do. So Honeybadger is the place to check out for error and uptime monitoring, and it's only getting better. So check them out at honeybadger.io.
So that's a huge pain point for me. And it is the reason I went to Alpine like immediately in this last project, because the recommended advice right now is there's like a third-party library called L-Transition that will expose that type of functionality for you. But one of my favorite things, and I'd like to get into Headless UI stuff a little bit, is that, and this is available in components and Headless UI, is in Tailwind UI examples, like when there's transitions, there's like classes you have to apply for like each transition. You've like abstracted that and you're just like transition from like this point, and it does it automatically, and it rules so hard.
So the transition thing, that was one of the earlier additions, and it was basically driven out because of Tailwind UI. Like I'm friends with Adam, and a lot of like early Alpine was driven out with him, where he's like, this is cool. It's almost like pseudocode that works. So that's why like early Tailwind UI was mostly Alpine. I think they just removed it under the hood. I don't know. But for the longest time, like you guys know, if you wanted the Alpine, you just go to the dev tools and you copy out or HTML. And now you get the Alpine version that was never advertised, but that's what it was under the hood. But anyway, when we got to the transitions, he's like, you know, those guys are so fanatical about just UI fidelity. Everything has to be like you're on an iPhone. Like it has to be the most polished, the most academically pure thing. That's just their shtick. You know, with transitions, I was like, oh yeah, dude, no problem. X show, yeah, add a fade in, fade out. And then he would like push me harder. Like, no, like I need the kind of transitions where in is twice the length of the out, and the Bezier curve is custom, and it can be canceled mid transition and reversed. And if you have like a bunch of nested transitions, like in a modal where the background fades, but the foreground is scaled, I need all those to be coordinated so they can be canceled in a cascading way. Crazy stuff. And then if it's all wrapped in an X show or some kind of toggle, it doesn't just immediately close. Like an X show will listen for all the nested transitions to finish. So whatever. Alpine's transition is like this insanely robust system, basically because Adam just kept pushing me to like, no, if I'm going to use this thing, it has to be like amazing. So it's pretty good, and you get a lot, and you can break out into like X transition and then all the different gates of the transition and use your custom classes, which would work great with Tailwind UI. You copy all the classes, but the way I use it, I don't know if this is what you're referring to, Jason, the like X transition dot opacity.
Yeah,
like just straight up X transition is just a great default to me.
And there's one that like you can specify like what axis something comes in from.
Yeah, the origin. You could be like X transition. If you wanted a transition that was like 500 milliseconds, scaled, and came in from the top left and whatever, and only did it in, you would be like X transition dot duration dot 500, which would be 500 milliseconds. Or you could literally type 500 ms dot scale dot origin dot top dot left dot in, and that would do it. And that stuff for me, I don't know how many people use that, but I am not going to fiddle with CSS classes for these crazy transitions. I need a simple composable language for me.
I was so thrilled to see that because like I was copying Tailwind UI example, like components and pasting them in. And I'm like, oh, I can just delete all this like transition stuff that's like, make sure you apply these. I'm like, nah, I got it. It's cool.
And all the defaults came from Tailwind, which came from materials. Material Post has like a big spec of the best way to do transitions and the custom curve to use and the right timing differences and everything. So that's mostly what Adam referenced. And so I just took all of those and was like, these will be the defaults. This is just what you get with X transition.
It gives me such a high quality result with such little effort. And like, that's what I'm going for every day. If that's the life hack I'm trying to do, it's that.
Yeah.
Just use tools like that.
That's the whole ethos. Like we just added X collapse for like an accordion when you need to transition height or animate height. That's a hard problem that you can't just like easily do a CSS transform and keep things like reflowing smoothly, without just like jostling. So whatever, like, so there's a plugin for that. And I don't know. That's my whole thing is take a problem that people have to do that is really hard and turn it into some simple composable API that you can just throw on and get going and be like, wow, how could it be that simple? That's the thing that motivates me most in my whole development career is like, the more something that's super complex can be like pushing that envelope of how simple it can be. That's, the most fun I think that I have in programming. So yeah. So try Alpine. Sales pitch. This is a hard sales pitch.
I'm going to keep going on the sales pitch because you released a series of components over the last couple of years, last year. And it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was at least at the time a paid add-on. Is that still the case or is it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when Headless UI came out, Tailwind announced that it was originally like Alpine, React, Vue, and it was always like Alpine coming soon. And then Alpine disappeared.
I know.
And then so did all of my hope of free JavaScript functionality in Tailwind UI.
Yeah.
And then, as I mentioned, a week or two ago, I got an email because I had bought the component library saying you were working on Headless UI for Alpine. And so I would really just kind of like to hear more about that. Maybe what your involvement with the official Headless UI looks like, what your roadmap is. Let's go.
Yeah. Let me like brief Alpine components and then talk about Headless UI. So kind of the goal of Alpine components, one goal is to monetize Alpine. I didn't really have a way to monetize before. I don't have videos. I don't have sponsors or anything. So I wanted to make a product and it was going to just be an educational product. And then I thought, well, why don't I make it both? I'll build components that people need and I'll give you the code that like Tailwind UI-esque like copy and pastable code, but then screencasts where I build the thing and you can watch me build it and it'll be like a masterclass in Alpine if you want, or you can just take the code and have your components. And this is for all the extra things that people want, like Tricks integration. People are like, I want to use Tricks in my Laravel app with Alpine or whatever. How do I do that? And so I just wanted to have like, here you go. Like, here's a snippet you can copy paste, has Tricks included, and you can just easily get and set the text content of a Tricks editor. So we've done that for a bunch of things. But we, of course, wanted to tackle all the main UI components that you have in your app, like any given app. Modal, dropdown, tabs, list goes on, accordion, carousel, stuff like that. So we did that. I just kind of went out to just build them on my own. And I did that. But here's what happened. Here's the whole like conflict of this story is when I started Alpine, it was to make building modals insanely easy, like X show and then a Boolean. And then, this is attributed directly to Adam and the Tailwind crew, basically, where he sort of showed me that like, hey, if you want to actually do this right, if you want to build a modal that Stripe would have on their website, it's a lot more involved than that. There's focus trapping. You have to trap the focus inside the modal and you have to disable scrolling behind it. You have to add all the proper ARIA attributes. You have to in popovers, and like you have to have keyboard controls and all sorts of things that are just like things that your average developer is never going to do. I never did, and I never would. I still wouldn't build that on my own. No way. I would use a package. Bootstrap used to give you a lot of this kind of out of the box when you'd copy and paste that big Bootstrap modal that everybody did. And so anyway, that was kind of a gap where like the Alpine quote unquote modal is more a toggle. You can toggle a piece of HTML, but if you really want to be, I'll just say academic, but you know what I mean? If you want to be like the best, most professional, robust thing that could show up on the New York Times and every screen reader and accessibility thing could use it properly, to do that is so involved. So that's what I set out with Alpine components was like, I'm going to make really robust components and put them out there. And so here's the conflict is somewhere along the line, I realized now it's all harder. I wanted to make a tool that you could just build a modal. And now you have to pay money to get a bunch of code to paste in. Like that's not what I wanted. So let me say that Alpine components is still great. There's lots of other stuff that you do want to copy and paste a bunch of code with, but like a modal and a drop down and stuff. Yeah, that's not what I want. And so what I've realized is I need to build Headless UI for Alpine, which will be X modal. Now you'll have an actual complicated modal, but use it simply. And why not keep total parity with Headless UI so that you can use it in Tailwind UI? Because that's a huge motivation for me. And so I guess there's some things that I probably can't give you like the full story because I don't want to like, I don't know. But I guess I'll just say that, yeah, I do have contact with the Tailwind folks. You know, I'm friends with Adam, but it's not the kind of thing where, I don't know, like, and there were times where I was going to build it for them. And those are the things that I don't know how to go into. But I'll just say that the way that life has taken things is just that they're trying to slim down. Their new templates are only React. They're not even Vue. And so they got like a bunch of flack about that, but their stance is like, we're going to build for us and what we want. And the maintenance burden of managing two things like that is huge. So it's at this point where I think really I'll speak for them and say, it's like, we don't even want to be supporting Vue right now. So why would we build Alpine and make our lives triple harder and hire more people to do all that stuff? So I've just sort of taken it upon myself to build my own version. And I guess if you're looking for, like, Adam knows about it, I've talked to him about it, and like he's excited about it. He's like, oh, great, good, you build it and then put it out there. And then so he wants it to exist. And I've already built it twice actually, but there's still a lot. I would love to maybe get in the weeds with you guys on like little micro decisions, whatever. Maybe now is not the time, but there's still lots of questions like how strictly do I adhere to the Headless UI API? Because there's certain areas where it's like, man, I don't think anybody needs that feature, or like that's for like a React paradigm.
That was one of the thoughts I had when you were talking about that, where it's like some things, depending on the tool, will be accomplishable really easily or really hard. And
yeah,
so I can imagine it'd be like trying to build the same project in Laravel and Rails. You can do that, but there's going to be a million different decisions along the way. So
yeah,
like,
just constraints.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah. So I'm trying to navigate that. And basically what I've realized, so here's my grand vision, is to build Headless UI from scratch for Alpine. I'm going to release it as part of the paid thing right now, but eventually I want to at least make a handful of them free. So it's just like super easy to use. Basically a modal dropdown and tabs in my mind. Alpine has to have that for free available. Like that's a goal. It's just, I got to get there. But so the goal is build this stuff in Headless UI. And the real goal is to build a converter where you can copy in any Tailwind UI code. You have to copy in like the Vue version. You paste it into the converter and it'll just convert it all to Alpine with all the right script tags and all the right whatever. And then you just paste it in. So that's where I'm headed. But I started building the converter and I'm like, this is going to be extremely interesting. It'll be a fun programming experiment, but it's going to be hard. Yeah.
I don't think I've literally been more excited about something related to programming than I am in like the last 3 minutes.
Nice.
Because when you're talking about like these micro decisions and stuff, if I'm going to use Headless UI with React, I'm just going to copy the React example for the component and paste it. I've never actually gone down to the deeper level of Headless UI. When I tried the React ones, I'm just like, I'm just going to take this and tweak it and it's fine.
And that's what everybody is doing. And I think it's really important for me to hear that from you and internalize that like people just want to find the examples and copy and paste them, and whatever else you got to do in between, that's between you and God. What we need is just code.
That's the reason why like I pulled in the Alpine stuff from Tailwind UI originally, because I was like, oh, I'll convert this stuff over to Stimulus because everything will be nicely Stimulus in my app. But as soon as I looked at it, I was like, no, I just want to copy paste, put it in the app and be done. And I don't care then if I'm using Alpine and Stimulus together, like whatever, they don't conflict and it's fine. So I'm in the same boat where I maybe eventually would customize things, but like most of the time I want the rough, really nice looking version, grab it, drop it in, move forward, finish the feature, maybe come back and like redesign little things here and there. But like I'm trying to get things done, which was the attractive thing about Bootstrap, I think, which had the tabs and all these widgets that were functional and you could just grab them
Basic
and
stuff,
go.
yeah.
Just to add on to this, Twitter released this new like blogging thing. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but I was looking at their example and I was like, I really like how if you hover or press on the updated button, instead of showing you the date, like it shows it in a popover or a tooltip.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I want to build that. And so I went to the Alpine website. I'm like, all right, how am I going to figure out how to build this? And I clicked on the components tab and I was like, oh, he already has an example. Easiest money I spent in my life. I just copied that, pasted it in my code. We're done. I'm like, I so willing to pay money for something that saves me a bunch of time, especially if something I don't really want to have to think about. And yeah, for the drop downs and just going down the lines, I don't want to build this, copy, paste, then edit a little bit and just move on.
Yep. I mean, that's exactly what I'm after. And hopefully people view it the same way. I know there'll always be a swath of people where either they're from a country where the money is harder to come by, or it's just they don't feel like you should be paying for something like that. But yeah, of course, as the builder, you're like, man, this took me forever and Alpine's totally free and it's like $100 and it'll save you easily $100. So just buy it. But that's the mentality of when you're selling something, of course.
Yeah.
But that's the goal is like, yeah, just come and grab what you need. And
yeah, anybody who's actually tried to build like a modal from scratch will quickly learn that like, oh, I got to freeze the window so it doesn't scroll. And then the scroll bar disappears on OS 10. So I got to add padding for that. And like, you will realize you go down that rabbit hole and you will save so much time just copy and paste the properly working example. That's easily worth it if you've ever done that from scratch.
Yeah. Like portals, like a modal, like you want to find the modal somewhere deep in your DOM tree, like in a component in the backend or whatever. But if it's rendering there, like the whole modal like is rendered inside of something else because it's like fixed positioned or something like that. So you need to actually like render the HTML at the end of your like body tag, but declare it somewhere else. And so React and Vue have portals for that kind of thing. So in Alpine, I build portals. It's like in Alpine, you could just be like X teleport any bit of HTML and it'll teleport it somewhere else. But then with
That's
like
such a cool name.
Yeah. Now you have to do all the focus trapping and all that stuff. But in another place in the DOM, like you're saying, if you try to build this stuff on your own, it's such a massive undertaking. So
I'll even add on to that and say, so Chris and I had started a project and I had built it. I'm talking like 2 months ago. I was like, I'm going to use Bootstrap. Like I love Tailwind UI, but JavaScript is like, I'm tired of writing these interactions. But I got like pretty much done and I was like, I really wish this was Tailwind, right?
Yeah.
And so as much as I tweaked it, it still felt like Bootstrap. And
right.
So I've been working in Tailwind in between this Bootstrap to Tailwind phase I'm going through on this project. I got to a modal and I was like, oh, this is the prime example, right? I got to a modal. Like Chris said, I'm like, I'm just going to build this myself. How hard can it be? And then pretty quickly, I was like, this is the worst thing I've ever done. And so it's not just building it from scratch. So even trying to use third-party like modal libraries are very complicated. I found a couple of NPM packages and trying to like wire them up to like work how you want it to work. It was difficult. And that's why when I like got the Headless UI email, I was like, this is perfect because I'm not good at this kind of stuff.
Yeah. I used a Sweet Alert for a while. Did you guys ever use that? That was like a way to just have modals, but it's super sweet. It's like super Sweet Alerty. Like if you see one now, you're like, oh yeah, they just use Sweet. It's so branded kind of look thing.
Yeah, and it's always like tricky to, you think you could go replace all their CSS and make it fully branded, but it's like, all of their HTML is structured in a certain way. So like you still are working around that. It's not like you're rewriting the HTML that it generates. You're taking your select twos or whatever else, and you can apply your theme to it, but the HTML structure is all the same.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's the tendency to, it always feels the same. Or you dig into it and you're like, oh my God, there's 150 different classes and I got to go learn each one of those and where and why it's here, and then customize it. And you realize really quickly it's not worth the effort for styling it.
Totally. Just like digging through and trying to like, you're like, I need the class when the select to drop down is open and like blank. So, okay, we'll get that in that state. Open the dev tools. Oh, now I clicked away and it's gone. Shoot. Like now I got, then I like, okay, I have to set a set timeout and a debugger statement so that when it's open, it'll freeze and then I can go and, yeah, it's definitely a wild, it's not worth it. We've all been there.
I do want to also talk about Livewire. So maybe just a quick overview of Livewire, and then maybe I would like to just talk about some of the like implementation details from like a programmer's perspective to maybe compare it to some of the tools we have in Rails.
So the fundamental concept is the same as like Hotwire or Phoenix Live View, and it's what if instead of basically passing JSON between the server and the browser and then turning that JSON, reacting the HTML, in the browser, it's like, well, what if we kept all the rendering on the back end and just send HTML over the wire, Hotwire. That's been like something I've been jazzed about since before Livewire, just like straight up raw AJAX requests. Hey, what if I just start returning these partials that I render with the page, but just return them over AJAX and .inner HTML, some div? Honestly, still to this day is a great technique. You don't need a framework for it. You just do it. So Livewire kind of came out of that, but I saw like Phoenix Live View's approach, which was like, okay, there's a class with properties and methods, and then a view, and that view can access those properties and call those methods in a long-running browser way. Somehow that backend code lives in the browser. It doesn't, but it appears that way. Somehow it lives in the browser, and somehow when you click a button in the browser, it just calls a backend method. You don't have to write an endpoint or deal with any of that wiring. And so I saw that and I was like, that is awesome. That's the evolution of just like manually making endpoints that return HTML partials. It's like, that's the most clean expression of just taking out that whole middle layer and just marrying the front and the back and blurring that line, because it just kind of illuminated that like, oh, all that other stuff is actually, it's just bootstrap stuff. It's just scaffolding. Really what you're doing with all like programming those individual back and front end communication layers and all that, it really is actually something that you can make invisible. And that's what Phoenix Live View showed me. So Livewire started from that. That's kind of where its relation with Live View ends. It does a bunch of different things and does them differently. There's no WebSockets or anything like that. It's very much just under the hood. Looks like if you looked at your dev tools, it's just AJAX requests being sent to the server and then HTML coming back. It's the fundamental bit. But the key difference between Hotwire and Livewire is Livewire has a whole like front end focus. Hotwire is very constrained, not in a bad way. It's like a very simple set of tools to swap HTML into the front end, where Livewire, like your Livewire component has state. If you have a counter in Livewire, it's like count is a property on a class that you can actually access in JavaScript with Alpine. And you can manipulate it with Alpine or call a method on the class with Alpine. And if that method in PHP mutates the property, it'll reflect in the DOM because it'll all be re-rendered.
I'm interested in especially the state storing aspect of it, because we have a tool in Rails called Stimulus Reflex that does some of that, like kind of keep state every time like you, and it's WebSocket based. Every time you like perform a reflex, it sends like the element over. And so you can pull things off that, but it's kind of manually wired up state. And so in Livewire, is state declared kind of in the front end, or is it actually declared like in the PHP side of things?
It all starts in the PHP side. So any public property, I call it like dehydrating and hydrating. So after the first request, your whole component, which is your class, gets dehydrated. I take the I render the HTML, so I have all this just plain HTML, but then I also dehydrate the state of the component. So if you have a public property that's an integer, that'll go into a JSON object where you have like count, colon, and then an integer. And then that lives in JavaScript alongside the HTML so that when a request is made again and go back, it sends that snapshot back to the server and then is hydrated from that data back into a PHP class and then to be dehydrated again.
That is very, very smart. Does the implementer have to do anything to set that up? If they declare a property in PHP, is it just available to them?
It's just available. And so that's obviously easy with integers and strings and such. But, in PHP or in Laravel, there's like collections, which people use instead of arrays. It gives you like a lot of the nice things that Ruby has out of the box. Basically, it's like Ruby arrays or whatever you call them, sets or lists or whatever. All those like .filter, .map, all that isn't really available in PHP in a nice syntax. So anyway, if you store a collection as a property, you want it to be a collection next request in PHP, but JavaScript doesn't know what a collection is. So there's like custom dehydrators where they're programmed in so that they know, okay, this collection, we're going to turn it into a plain array for JavaScript, but we're going to store some metadata that tells PHP how to turn it back into a collection. So we've done that with models from the database, like active record kind of thing, where you could store like a model as a property and we would dehydrate just the data of the model. And then the metadata would be the ID in the database connection, any relationships we need to load. So if you're queuing a job, I don't know, at least in Laravel, like if you queue a job, all your data relating to the job has to be serialized for when it like gets handled. And so I just use actually those serializing faculties in Laravel for like models and stuff, but just send it to the front end. Yeah. And there's some security stuff, like there's a checksum that makes sure that none of it's tampered between requests and that kind of thing.
I have to say real quick, you have a real gift for naming things. I love hearing you talking about like custom dehydrators and stuff like that. I would just be like, class 2. I'm really bad at naming things.
Well, thank you. If I'm good at it at all, it's just like observing and absorbing Taylor, the Laravel creator's knack for naming things. But the more typical word is serialize and deserialize.
Right.
But for some reason with my brain, it's hard to visualize which one is which. Even though one is like D in front of it, I don't know why it's hard for me. But
it's like, which direction is it going?
Yeah.
Like, am I serializing it going or like coming from? And
I have to think about it for like a second, where hydrating and dehydrating to me is like a military meal that's like dehydrated in its state, but then you hydrate it and it comes back to life. So it has those visuals for me. Anyway, that's where that comes from. But
sorry, that was an aside, but I'm jealous of that skill. The other thing about Livewire, you mentioned it doesn't work on WebSockets. It just works over Ajax. That's something that appealed to me. So like Hotwire by default works over Ajax. And we do some WebSocket over the wire stuff at my day job at Podia. And it works well. But there are certain scaling challenges we've had with WebSockets. And like, we're really good at making Ajax requests. Like, we're really good at scaling HTTP requests, but we've had a harder time scaling WebSockets.
Livewire started on WebSockets because LiveView is WebSockets. And I was just like, oh yeah, it's like so fast. You can keep the long running instance in the backend. But when I was doing a bunch of user tests before I released Livewire, he was a contributor to Laravel and he's from Europe and uses Symfony a lot. And he's like, you're going to isolate. This is going to be a toy project if you stick with WebSockets. Like, for people to really scale them and manage the infrastructure well, it's like you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. And I had an Ajax driver and I like showed him. He's like, it's just funny because I remember at one point thinking like, what? That's crazy. But now it just made the tool so accessible for everybody because you need zero extra infrastructure. There's nothing that your server does that has to know anything about Livewire. It's straight up just PHP code, and the network is just the way normal Ajax requests are sent. It's just a machine that does it for you. PHP is not even like as well suited as Ruby. Long running connections. There's no long running instance in PHP. It's a whatever share nothing architecture. It all gets built up and torn down.
Right.
So with WebSockets, it's like even harder. So I guess real quick, you still need real-time stuff. And so Laravel has this thing called Echo, which uses Pusher or your own WebSocket server to send events to the browser. And Livewire is integrated with that. So like,
gotcha.
If for like one thing in your app, if you were queuing a job with a button and you wanted it to turn green when it was finished or something, you could send a WebSocket request that way.
That's cool. So I mentioned the stimulus reflex.
Yeah, I've heard
runs
of
on-
that before. Yeah, I've heard a lot about
similar. Yeah, it's similar. It runs on WebSockets. I think they have shipped or we're working on an Ajax like adapter for it. But the library it's built on top of is called Cable Ready. Have you ever heard of that library?
No.
Okay, so Cable Ready is probably one of my favorite libraries. Now it is WebSocket based, but
Is this like a Rails proper thing? Because there's
Mhm.
cables or active cable or some
there's
sort of
Action Cable,
action cable. Okay.
which is basically Echo in Laravel.
Okay.
It's like the Rails abstraction of WebSockets.
Okay.
But this Cable Ready library, what it does is basically it's simple. You just broadcast JavaScript events from Ruby over WebSockets. So if I was doing this like pure Action Cable, I'd like define some kind of message that I'd send to WebSocket over WebSockets, and JavaScript wise, I'd listen to it in React.
Okay.
But the way like Cable Ready works is you can be like, oh, I want to send an inner HTML event on this element.
Okay.
And then it'll just like, it has a client side library. And so it'll go find the element and set inner HTML for you to the value. It's really cool.
Interesting. What is that? I gotta look
It's
that up.
Cable Ready.
Cable Ready. Okay.
Yeah.
Shot that.
It's
Yeah,
really
that's-
cool.
The new Turbo Links became Turbo, and they have a similar concept where you can send over, rather than like WebSocket packets, it's sending over HTML that gets dropped in, and they are a Turbo Stream tag that has an action on it, which then it has a object in JavaScript with all of those names, and it will just find the matching one, run the function, and give it that element. So you can have a turbo stream to append the HTML in this template
Right.
to whatever ID. And it's a similar kind of concept where you don't have to use WebSockets for it, but in Turbo you
Right.
can. You can actually respond with HTML for a post request. You can respond with an action to go take the tweet that you just submitted and then prepend that on the list of tweets and clear out the tweet
Right.
form or whatever, things like that. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Both of those take the same approach of like, we'll figure out some format to send stuff over to the browser. And then
Yeah.
the JavaScript client has these standard actions that it can use to parse that and then just run your edit, prepend, update, whatever it might be, those things.
Right.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
That seems to be a very common method these days, at least in our world, of making real-time-esque updates to the browser.
The big
from the
thing
server.
that I'm curious about with something like Turbo, I'm jealous of this from a like an architecture standpoint. Everything in the Turbo world is fully swapped HTML, where Livewire intelligently morphs the HTML, like Phoenix Live View does. It currently uses morphed whatever. I have a new package to use.
You
But
have a
they-
new package that's not Morphdom?
Yeah,
That's
it's
wonderful.
actually out. It's a plugin for Alpine called Morph that I'm rewriting Livewire to use it, but it's freely available right now. And it's fully Alpine aware. So you can straight up, like literally with one script tag, be like alpine.morph some element into another element or to HTML, and it will only find the diffs and make those patches, and it'll preserve all your Alpine state. That's kind of the big nice thing is like it takes that new HTML and it clones it with all the new Alpine, the same Alpine state, and then it does the patch. Yeah, not many people know about because it's not like a very consumer-y package. It's more like if you want to get into stuff on your own or if you're building a framework, like you probably want to use it. But with Turbo stuff, they just hard wipe the HTML. And that was like an issue for me right away. I started with that, but you just lose so much state and like transitions are almost impossible and all this stuff. So I am curious. Is that
there's
a big con or trade-off of using those tools?
at least in the current beta of Turbo, there is the ability for you to add your own actions for those Turbo Stream changes. So you can add morphdom in there. And that was like one of the first things that people did. So you can basically add that in and say, hey, let's morph this element. And that could be triggered from the server side or whatever, even the client side too. But that was, if you're doing any of those updates, it was just replace the HTML and blew everything away. And so, yeah, you would either lose the state or whatever, or you would have to keep the state in the HTML, like as data attributes that your stimulus controllers would just reference, and they would have to go and keep those updated. So if they changed and incremented the count, it would want to set, or maybe in a tab example, set on the tabs element, the current selected one, so that, like, you know, if it changed.
Would mutation observer like pick up the change in the data attribute?
Yeah.
And then would there be a hook in Stimulus, or would it just like tear down the component and recreate it and it would be reinitialized? Or
there's definitely hooks for when the like data values change, and you can do that stuff.
Gotcha. Okay.
In general, the Stimulus controller wouldn't modify any of the HTML, so it would be one of those like turbo stream events that would do that. But any like page navigation stuff will blow everything away. But that is what would happen normally in the browser. So I think that's okay there.
And Turbo Links, I mean, I used Turbo Links for a while, Turbo Drive, which is great. And there's all sorts of faculties to persist elements across page loads and things like that.
Right. Yeah. There is the like data turbo permanent or whatever to keep your nav bar or whatever it is that you want to stay persisted across. Yeah. And that was like always the biggest flaw of TurboLinks came out, and it was a cool idea, but you never had anything to maintain that stuff as pages transitioned. So rather than you
have hooks to do that, I thought it didn't.
Not really. So like until Stimulus came out, it was you were writing your own turbo load events, like in Event Listener, or a lot of people just wrote them in jQuery still. And so you would have to go and say, okay, let's go check and see if Google Analytics is set up.
I remember.
Whatever. So it
all
didn't
your
really
document DOM content loadeds now had to be turbo : load.
It didn't really ever feel. It just feel like they fixed one issue but brought up a lot of other issues.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And now at least we have that balance of, similar to what you were doing in Alpine, we can write a Stimulus controller that wraps flat picker pretty easily and whatever. But yeah, we wish we had all those tools when TurboLinks came out, because that's why everybody hated on it so much.
Yeah, I can see that. And really, the solution is not like any new tech or approach. It's just that to use more first-party Railsy stuff that just works with it. I definitely admire, like I said, I guess from like an architecture perspective, MorphDOM has its own set of woes and introduces its own set of a serious set. I'm gonna pick that, but man, like there are definitely things that it's like, whoa. There's just a simplicity and a reliability to the approach that Turbo uses of just straight wiping HTML. And, that's obviously like a huge strong point of the community, is just double down on a philosophy, like in HTML. If it's data, it's got to be in the HTML, and that's where it lives. And we're not going to extract it into some memory thing, and then the HTML is going to be out of sync with that. It's like, no, that's the source of truth, which is cool.
Yeah.
That's if you really just double down on that.
It provides, I guess, sort of the same mechanism with like the variables in Alpine, where you can have one component talk to another by modify that data attribute and set its value, and then the other one can listen to that and react to it or whatever. So
yeah, fast.
I guess. And I don't think that was originally in the first release of Stimulus. So it was one of those like pain points that everybody realized, because I remember
such an
we were like
approach to inter-component communication.
Yeah.
Really like mutating the DOM signal.
It becomes a source of truth. It's wild.
Because it used to be, if you wanted two Stimulus controllers to talk to each other, the first one would create a custom event, fire that event on the other HTML element, and you'd have to write your data action and say, hey, we listened to this custom event and wire it up. But like to your point of trying to build these frameworks where those pieces that are manual but could be invisible, make them invisible, and then life is so much easier. And that is another example of that, where that's the goal, I guess, is just to build the abstraction well. You make those pieces invisible, and then life becomes worrying about that higher level now, and you don't have to think about
conceptual compression is the DHH thing. That's what it's all about. What complexity can you compress into something that is like,
That's actually a great example for me, at least. We were talking earlier about when I go to Tailwind UI and I just want to copy and paste something. It's not necessarily the exact same because it's not necessarily hiding it all away, but it's less I have to think about. Someone's done the hard work. It's good. Exactly what you're talking about with Tailwind earlier. Like, I know they're very meticulous, and I love that. So I know that when I use it as they intend, I'm going to have a really high quality output.
I know. Yeah. But if you attempt it on your own.
Yes. And so I want the least friction to get there. So.
Right. But if it was complete, that's the real challenge is if it was a complete black box, then it would, I think, die the death of all those other, even, I'm not saying that Bulma is dead or anything, but all those other CSS sort of off the shelfy things where it's
they all look the same.
They all look the same. And then there's a shelf life on it because eventually the trends will move and people will resent that style and it will feel dated. And then they'll move on to something that is more bespoke. Like with React, they have all this success, but it's the most like bespoke, like steep learning curve, nothing out of the box, not even a framework thing. It's still kind of a mystery to me, but I think part of that is that it's such like a core utility that I don't know. Yeah, if that makes sense. It's so similar, I guess, with like Tailwind is like it has a longer shelf life because it's not so opinionated and out of the boxy. You know, it's harder to maintain your place at the top when you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah. When in 5 years, like the internet will just visually look different, like the trends and stuff.
Yeah.
And Bootstrap's done a pretty good job of keeping up, but even like each new release you still tell it's Bootstrap.
Customizing it, the story of customizing Bootstrap's just not as, I have to remember that like Tailwind is, I'm a huge believer in it. I use it for everything, but I've done like some projects in the past year that are just throwaway and it's like, man, instead of wasting all this time, I'm just going to I should probably just use Bootstrap, but there's one out there that's like a Tailwind Bootstrap kind of thing.
Daisy UI.
Yeah, Daisy UI. I was just like, and I just used it for fun and was like, oh, wow. I remember what it's like to just be like, BTN. Card, BTN, panel title. It's like, okay, that's pretty nice for some things. Daisy's pretty cool, actually. Yeah. There's a real place for that kind of thing.
Yeah. Daisy's cool because you get all those things out of the box, but then you still have the full power of Tailwind at your disposal, where Bootstrap has helper utilities or just utilities in the last couple of releases, but they're still like scoped down, right? And they still follow the same Bootstrap like style guide. So with Tailwind, where I can adjust padding from like 0.5 to 64 or whatever, right? Bootstrap is 1 through 5. So
yeah, right. It is more constrained. And with like Tailwind made that real turn in the road with the JIT compiler.
Yes.
And that was a huge risk. And like, good for them. And now like the way I use it with that, I'm sure you guys too, with like brackets and like, stuff I used to have to use inline
custom things.
Yeah. I use those all the time to a fault. I'll be like, I'm not going to configure that color in my config file. I'm going to grab that color and I'm going to BG-bracket $ that color or hashtag that color and copy that in a bunch of different places.
I recently used the square brackets to pass CSS variables into. So this project I'm working on, like you can change your brand color. And because of JIT, I can't just be like, oh, I'll just assign this color because it all happens when it renders the page. The color's in my database. I can't just put every color into the JIT.
Oh, you needed to change mid-page load.
While the page is loading, I want to set. So I'm using CSS variables to like set colors and then referencing them like as BG- square brackets color :var and spitting out the variable.
Interesting. That's clever.
It rules. I found it. Found somebody referencing online, so I can't take credit for it, but it's been fun.
When you like are in the dev tools and you're, I use this way more than the Tailwind docs is like typing in the add class little bit and letting it autocomplete. But with JIT, you only get the auto completion of things you already have like for that page. And that's been a huge bummer. So love JIT, love Tailwind, but that's one little bit that I'm like, dang it. I don't remember what the widest tracking.
Have I brought in PY3 yet?
Yeah, I know.
PY2 and PY4.
And you're like pumped when you're in a project that's like big enough that you're like, oh man, I got PY. Yeah, I got all the P's and all the M's.
I used W full last night in the browser and the DevTools updated. And I was like, my work here is done.
Yeah, I got W full now. Yeah.
I'm upset.
That's hilarious.
The last thing I just want to ask you about. So there's different like acronyms that go around about like stacks. And one of the ones I hear a lot is the tall stack, which is Tailwind, Alpine, Laravel, and Livewire. Is that correct?
Yep.
How does it feel to create 2 of the 4 in that stack?
I guess pretty cool. if I think about it for a minute, it feels pretty cool. I think, there's always the weird thing where like you never feel like you've arrived, or you always feel like, I don't know, the people you admire or the tools you admire will always feel like you'll never be there. I don't know. And so at least that's how I feel with stuff like that. So I'm not 1/4 of tall. It's like Laravel, behemoth, massive, amazing, and then Tailwind, and then it's like, then Livewire and Alpine, so I don't know. I'm being humble, but yeah.
It's pretty badass. Those are two, I've never used Livewire, but those are two very powerful, easy to build tools. So I think it's pretty
I can at least attest to that. I'll give you that. Not easy to build. Yeah. I've been trying to rewrite Livewire for like a year and a half, and I'm always trying again. Just, complex stuff, but.
Yeah. And there's also Livewire. So one of the hot topics I have is that Rails doesn't ship with authentication, but that's like a 6-hour discussion.
Wow.
Oh,
really?
It does not. So
wait, with just like auth scaffolding or with actual authentic?
Auth scaffolding. You can, there's one thing that is just like has secure password that you can bring in.
Yeah.
And it will basically hash passwords for you using bcrypt and give you like an authenticate method. But everything else you build yourself. That's another point. But recently, if I'm not mistaken, Laravel shipped like 2 auth scaffolding packages, and one of them was Livewire. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, that was actually kind of, when you look at the analytics of like Composer installs, which is our package manager of Livewire, it's like they're growing, and then they just triple overnight. And that was when Jetstream was released with Livewire, which is awesome. Taylor's been super supportive. He's awesome. He just added a bunch of new documentation for Livewire. Like, it's very much second party, quote unquote, which is just awesome. He loves the tool, and, we talk about it, and he's just been nothing but awesome about it. I don't know. He doesn't have to do any of that, but he has, and that means the world, I guess. And that has been that feels awesome to me. Yeah. It's like if Taylor likes something of mine and uses it and puts it in like the way you build Laravel apps, that's like kind of
exactly.
Yeah.
To me, that would be like one of the most affirming things. Oh, the creator of the framework I built the tool for is like, you know what? We're going to ship like an official tool, official package.
Yeah.
That implements this. That is.
Yeah, it was wild, like reading his code of like how he uses Livewire. He uses it in like interesting ways. And I don't know. He's kind of an artist. He's just whatever. If I haven't hinted at it, I really respect the guy, and I think he's amazing. And just seeing how he used my tool and the way he writes his own Livewire code is just cool. And really cool.
Well, we've kept you quite a while. Where are some places people can find you online, and what are some ways people can support your work?
Yeah, buying the stuff is the way to support the work. If you use Alpine, buy the components. And if you use Livewire, buy the screencasts. Both cost $100 right now. I think maybe $129 is the Alpine. I don't remember. But they're about $100 each. That's where I make all my money. I'm trying to hire people full time. I hire other people and try to grow in that way. And so it directly kind of rolls back into progress for the tools. But that's how you can support me. You can find me on Twitter. That's where I hang out. So Caleb Porzio on Twitter. And I do have a website and other stuff, but I don't post anything ever. And I have a newsletter I post every 4 months or something. So you can get on that, but Twitter's where I talk about stuff.
Twitter's like the modern day business card.
I know. Just here's my Twitter. I also have 2 podcasts that are somewhat regularly updated. No Plans to Merge is like 2 devs just shooting the breeze and hanging out, and it's goofy and fun. My buddy Daniel. And then I have a personal one, Notes on Work, where I record like 10-minute reflections. So those are my 2 podcasts. So check that stuff out. That's me. That's all my stuff.
It rules. I very much appreciate you joining us. Just talk about Alpine and Livewire, all the things. And I'm very excited to see what else emerges from Headless UI for Alpine.
Yeah, it's a good motivation for me, and a ton of fun hanging out with you guys. Could do it for many more hours. Awesome time, and I appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. This was really fun, and just give me more components that I can copy paste. That's all I want.
Yep. Yeah, that's the takeaway. Done.
All right, well, we will talk soon.